You know what's strangest about injustice? It doesn't come with thunder and lightning. It's quiet. It looks like a regular Sunday dinner, like a calm father's voice, like a brother's smile. I was 14 years old when I first placed an envelope of money on the kitchen table. My money, earned with my own hands. I remember how my fingers trembled, not from fear, from pride. I thought they'd be happy for me. I thought my father would say something important, something I'd carry with me for the rest of my life. Instead, my brother looked at the envelope, then at me, and laughed. Just laughed, and said, "You look like some street vendor." My father said nothing. My mother looked away. And I stood at that table and felt something inside me quietly, slowly, and permanently shut itself closed. But for you to understand why that moment meant so much, I need to tell you everything from the beginning. My name is Vera. I'm 23 now. I have my own apartment, one I pay for myself, a job I got on my own, and the first vacation of my life that I chose entirely by myself without anyone's permission or help. But behind all of that is a story I couldn't bring myself to tell out loud for a long time. Because it's not about villains. It's about something more uncomfortable. People who love you, but don't see you. A family where one child gets everything, and the other grows up learning to do without. I was the younger child, 3 years younger than my brother. And for as long as I can remember, I lived by different rules. Not because anyone hated me. No, it was subtler than that, and so much more painful because of it. I was simply considered the one who could handle it, the strong one, the self-sufficient one. It sounded like a compliment. For a long time, I believed it myself. But one day I understood. It wasn't a compliment. It was an explanation for why I didn't need to be given what my brother received. Why spend resources on someone who managed just fine on her own? My brother's name was Arthur. Art. Dad's Art. He was older, he was a boy, and in our family, as it turned out, that meant a great deal. Every summer, camp or a trip somewhere. Every birthday, something big and real. Every failure of his was explained by circumstances. Every success of mine was treated as a matter of course. I won't say I grew up in poverty or that anyone neglected me. I had clothes, food, a roof over my head. But there are things that matter more than material things. There's the feeling of being seen. The sense that your presence in a family is not just a fact, but a value. That I never had. And the hardest part? I didn't understand it right away. At first, I just lived. Then I started noticing. Then I started comparing. And at some point, the comparing became unbearable. If you've ever felt invisible inside your own home, you know exactly what I mean. If you haven't, I'll tell you how it happens. Slowly, quietly. So gradually that at first you don't even realize what's going on. Here's a fact I still can't shake from my head. I was 9 years old. Arthur was 12. We both wanted bikes. I asked for 3 months. Politely, patiently, the way I'd been taught. Arthur asked once. At dinner, casually, in passing. A week later, there was a bike in the hallway. Blue, shiny, with reflectors on the wheels. I was told, "We don't have the money right now. Wait until next year." Next year came. Then another one. I never got a bike. I didn't throw a fit. I rarely threw fits. That was also part of how they saw me. Vera is calm. Vera will understand. Vera won't make a fuss. But Arthur could. Arthur could slam a door, could push back from the dinner table with a scowl on his face, could say something sharp to our father, and still, the next morning, get exactly what he wanted. Because people talked to him. His mood mattered. His wishes required a response. Mine were easier to ignore. For a long time, I wondered, maybe I was imagining things? Maybe this is normal. Maybe every family is like this. Kids always think the other one gets more. But then the gaming console incident happened, and I stopped doubting myself. Arthur turned 13. He was given a gaming console, an expensive one he'd been talking about for 6 months. Dad brought it home in a big box wrapped in gift paper. I remember watching Arthur tear through that paper while our father stood beside him smiling that warm, real smile I didn't see from him very often. 3 days later, I asked for a book I needed for school. Not as a gift, just a book, required reading for class. Not expensive. Dad said, "Why buy it? Just get it from the library." I got it from the library. That was it. No evil intent, no dramatic scene. The console mattered, the book didn't. Arthur's want counted. My need didn't. I started observing it the way a researcher would, without tears, just noting facts. Who got the bigger portion at dinner when there wasn't enough for everyone? Whose school supplies got bought first when money was tight? Who could come home late without a single word said about it? Who had to give advance notice or face a confrontation? It wasn't anger I was building up inside myself. It was knowledge. Cold, precise, like a multiplication table. I was learning the rules of my family. And the more I learned, the clearer it became. The rules for Arthur and the rules for me had been written by different people. Mom felt it, I think. Sometimes she'd look at me with this expression, slightly guilty, slightly lost. She never said anything, but sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she'd run her hand over my head without a word, as if she wanted to pass something to me but didn't know how. I wasn't angry at my mom. I'm still not angry at her. She was invisible in her own way, just in her marriage rather than her childhood. We were alike in that sense. She had already learned to accept it. I hadn't. Not yet. I was 12 years old, late June. Dad was loading the car. A large blue duffel bag, an inflatable mattress in its case, Arthur's sneakers thrown into the trunk without ceremony. Mom was carrying the thermos and a bag of snacks for the road. I stood in the hallway with a question I'd been turning over in my head for days, not daring to say out loud. I finally did. "Dad, what about me?" He didn't turn around. He was checking whether the trunk latch was secure. "You're staying with Aunt Carol. You're old enough. You can help her around the house. She's all alone." Aunt Carol was our downstairs neighbor, 72 years old, a kind woman who gave me hard candies and told me stories about old movies. I had nothing against Aunt Carol. But I had something against the fact that my brother was going to the beach in Florida while I was staying behind to help around someone else's house. I didn't say that out loud. I stood there and watched the car back out of the driveway. Arthur waved at me through the window. Not cruelly, just casually. The way people wave when they're leaving and don't really think about who's being left behind. 2 weeks I spent at Aunt Carol's place, watered her plants, peeled potatoes, watched television with her in the evenings. She was grateful. She called me sweetheart and said I was worth my weight in gold. I smiled and thought about the ocean, about Arthur jumping into the waves right now, about how Dad was probably watching him with that same warm smile. I never got a postcard. Not one. When they came back, tanned, loud, with seashells in a plastic bag, Arthur tossed one shell to me right away. "Here, a souvenir." As if that settled everything. I took the shell, put it on the shelf, looked at it many times over the following weeks. And every time, I thought about the same thing. Not about the beach. Not about Arthur. I thought about the fact that if you want to be included, you have to be indispensable. You have to become someone they can't do without. Or, if you can't manage to be indispensable to them, you have to learn to do without them yourself. That's when something in me changed. It didn't explode or crack. It simply changed. Quietly and permanently. I stopped waiting for them to figure it out on their own. I started thinking about what I could do for myself. 12 years old. A bench in front of our apartment complex. Evening. A seashell in my pocket. And a feeling I didn't have a name for back then, but now I'd call it one word. Resolve. I saw the notice taped to the window of a bus shelter. A small slip of paper held up with Scotch tape. Help wanted at a flower shop. Part-time. No experience necessary. I was 14 years and 2 months old. Technically too young by the books. But I walked into that shop, introduced myself, said I was neat and reliable, and the owner, a woman in her mid-40s with tired hands and kind eyes, looked at me for a long moment without saying anything, and then said, "All right, come in Saturday at 8 a.m. I didn't tell my parents ahead of time. Not because I was afraid they'd say no. I just didn't want to explain myself. Didn't want to hear, "Why do you need this? You're just a kid." Or worse, silence. First Saturday. 6 a.m., I was already awake. Got dressed quietly, trying not to make noise. Dad was asleep. Mom was asleep. Arthur was asleep. As always, until noon. I slipped out of the apartment, walked down the stairs, and headed across the neighborhood on foot. 20 minutes of walking. Fall. Cold. My jacket not quite warm enough. But I walked and felt something that's hard to put into words. Not happiness exactly. More like rightness. The feeling that I was doing something that was mine. At the shop, I swept up, cleared stems, trimmed leaves, moved around buckets of water, helped wrap bouquets. Nothing complicated. But by the end of the shift, my hands smelled like greenery and cold water, my back ached slightly, and the owner, her name was Nina, said, "Come back next Saturday. You did well." I walked home smiling from ear to ear and felt slightly embarrassed about smiling over something so simple. But you did well from someone who's evaluating you honestly. That's completely different from "you're so self-sufficient" from parents who just find it convenient for you to be self-sufficient. A month in, Nina started paying me. Not much, laughable by adult standards. But those were dollars I had earned. Every bill was mine, completely, without conditions or explanations. My first paycheck came in an envelope, a small white envelope with bills folded neatly inside. I stepped into a building lobby on the way home, opened it, counted the money, and I think I just sat there for about 5 minutes, holding it in my hands. At home, I put the envelope on the kitchen table. And that's when what I described at the beginning of this story happened. Mom looked at it and said, "Well done, honey." But her voice was strange, not happy, more like something was quietly hurting her. Dad was drinking coffee and didn't look up. And Arthur, who was sitting right there scrolling on his phone, looked at the envelope, then at me, and said it. "You look like some street vendor." I picked the envelope back up, took it to my room, sat down on my bed, and thought for a long time. Not about what he said, about what none of them said in response. Dad didn't look up. Mom said nothing. That was the real news. Not my brother's words. He always said whatever crossed his mind. But the silence of the people who should have answered. I put the money in my desk drawer, wrote down the amount in my notebook, and thought very calmly, I need to save more. I saved methodically. I had a graph paper notebook where I recorded every dollar earned, every dollar spent, every balance. I was 14 years old, and I had a homemade accounting system in a plain school notebook. First, I bought myself warm tights, my own, not from the pile of clothes Mom bought once a year without asking. Then a textbook I needed for an after-school program that no one had gotten around to buying for me. Then a good pen and a fresh notebook. Small things, but every one of them was mine. Arthur, meanwhile, operated on a different logic. Every 2 or 3 weeks, something new appeared. Headphones, sneakers, money for the movies with friends. He didn't work. He asked and received. Sometimes after a fight, sometimes after long conversations, sometimes just like that. The system ran smoothly and reliably. One evening, I was sitting in my room doing homework when I heard a conversation in the kitchen. Arthur was talking to Dad. "Hey, Dad, I want to go away with some friends this weekend. There's a place up north. I need $300. Pause. Then the sound of a drawer opening, the rustle of bills. Dad said, "Take 400, just in case." 400. Just like that. In 3 seconds. I put my pen down on the notebook, sat quietly, then opened my notebook and looked at how much I'd saved. A little over 300, from a month and a half of work. I didn't cry. I just closed the notebook and thought, very calmly, I need to earn more. Nina gave me extra hours, started having me come not just Saturdays, but Sundays too, and sometimes Friday afternoons after school. I never complained about being tired, never asked for a day off. I liked it. Liked showing up and knowing my work had value here. Here, I was paid not out of pity, but because I was getting the job done. Nina was a woman of few words. She never said anything unnecessary. But once, I was washing out buckets in the back room. She was standing nearby sorting through delivery invoices. She said without looking up, "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Vera. People like you don't fall through the cracks." I kept that with me for years. By the end of my 14th year, I had a small financial system of my own. The notebook, labeled envelopes, goals written down. I had started saving for classes. There was a small school in our area where you could learn spreadsheet programs and word processing software. It wasn't expensive, but I still needed to save up. Nobody at home noticed any of this. Nobody asked how work was going. Nobody asked how much I'd earned, what I was spending it on, what I was thinking about. Mom would occasionally say, "Just don't burn yourself out." Dad said once, "Make sure your grades don't slip." Arthur said nothing. It simply didn't occur to him to think about it. I was part of the background. But the background was quietly saving money. The background was setting goals. The background was walking across the whole neighborhood at 6 in the morning and coming back with an envelope. And the background was thinking, one day, all of this will matter. I didn't know exactly when back then, but that it would, I knew for certain. Here's something that should have been a celebration. I was 16. Our high school ran a regional economics competition. Real judges, real prizes, real stakes. I'd been preparing for 3 months. I stayed up past midnight reading case studies. I practiced my presentation in front of the bathroom mirror so many times I had it memorized forwards and backwards. I did it entirely on my own. No tutor, no prep course, no parents sitting with me at the kitchen table saying, "Let me help you with that." The day of the competition, I took 2 buses to get to the venue. I wore the blouse I'd bought with my own money from the flower shop, pale blue, neatly pressed. I walked into that auditorium alone and sat down among kids whose parents had driven them there and were waiting in the lobby with coffee cups and proud, nervous faces. I won second place. A cash prize of $500 and my name printed in the county newspaper. A photograph, too. Me standing at the podium, holding a certificate, looking straight at the camera with an expression I barely recognized as my own. Confident, calm, like someone who belongs exactly where she's standing. I brought the newspaper home. Mom cut out the article and taped it to the refrigerator. She hugged me, and her eyes were wet. That part was real, and I held on to it. But then, Dad walked through the kitchen, glanced at the clipping, and said, "Just make sure this doesn't distract you from your actual schoolwork." Then he poured himself a glass of water and walked out. That was it. That was the whole response to $500 and a county-wide win and 3 months of midnight preparation. Arthur was in the living room when I came in. I told him about the prize. He looked up from the TV for about 2 seconds. "Cool," he said, then looked back at the screen. That same evening, Dad drove Arthur to the ATM. Arthur had asked for money to go to a weekend trip with friends, the same kind of trip he'd been taking all year, funded by the same drawer in the kitchen. I watched them leave from the window. 2 figures walking to the car. Dad's hand briefly on Arthur's shoulder. I stood at the window for a while after the car pulled out. $500. County newspaper. 3 months of work. And somehow, the thing that mattered in our house that evening was Arthur's weekend plans. I went to my room, opened my notebook, added the prize money to my savings column. The number was growing. That was real, too. That was mine in a way that no one's silence could touch. And I thought, very quietly, the way you think things you're not ready to say out loud yet, I thought, they will notice eventually. Not because they'll change, but because I won't stop. I was 16. I didn't know yet how right I was, or how long it would take, or what it would cost. But the number in the notebook kept growing. And that was enough for now. I want to tell you about a specific Tuesday in September, the year I turned 17. Because that Tuesday is the day I stopped hoping things would quietly work themselves out. I had just gotten my acceptance letter, full admission to a state university, 4-year program in business administration. Not just accepted, I'd qualified for a merit-based scholarship that covered 60% of tuition. I had applied without telling anyone, filled out every form myself, written my own essays, submitted everything on time. When the letter arrived, I read it 3 times standing in the hallway by the mailbox before I could make my legs move again. Arthur had failed his second attempt at community college entrance that same month. He'd taken the placement test twice. Both times, he didn't make the cut. He wasn't devastated about it, or if he was, he didn't show it. He was just home, sleeping late, eating cereal in front of the television, waiting for something to figure itself out for him. I told the family at dinner. I kept my voice steady and put the letter on the table like evidence. I got in. Full scholarship. I leave in August. Mom's face did something complicated, proud and scared at the same time. Dad nodded slowly and said, "Good. We'll figure out the rest of the costs." Then Arthur looked across the table at me. His expression was not proud. It was not happy. It was the face of someone who has just been personally insulted by another person's good news. He said, "You're always showing off, acting like you're better than everyone." I looked at him. I kept my face very still. Dad said nothing. He picked up his fork. Mom said, "Arthur, come on." That was it. Come on. Not, "That's not okay." Not, "Apologize." Just, "Come on." As if he'd spilled something minor and someone needed to wipe it up. Later that night, Mom came to my room. She sat on the edge of my bed and looked at her hands for a moment before she spoke. "Don't take it personally," she said. "He's going through a hard time. He's struggling with the whole college thing, and he's embarrassed." I looked at her. I thought about every time I had struggled without anyone noticing. Every early Saturday morning, every extra shift, every time I stayed up late studying while Arthur slept and Dad watched the news, and nobody asked if I needed anything. I said, "I know he's struggling, Mom, but I've been struggling for 3 years, and no one told me not to take that personally." She didn't answer. She patted my knee and left. I lay in the dark for a long time that night, not crying, just thinking. And the thought that kept coming back, clear and quiet and final, was this: no one in this house is going to protect me. Not from cruelty, not from being overlooked, not from anything. That's not because they're monsters. It's just not how this family is built. I was 17 years old, and that was the night I understood it completely. And once you understand something like that, really understand it, all the way through, you can't go back to pretending you don't know. I started counting down the months to August. August came. I packed 2 bags. Everything I owned that mattered fit into 2 bags, which told its own story. Dad drove me to the bus station. He carried one of the bags to the door. He said, "Call when you get there." I said I would. We didn't hug. We stood for a moment on the sidewalk, and then he turned and walked back to the car, and I picked up my bags and walked inside. I won't dramatize that moment. It was just a moment. A bus station on a Wednesday morning. But I will say, I stood in line for my ticket and realized that for the first time in 17 years, every decision in front of me was mine to make. Nobody to ask. Nobody to disappoint. Nobody to be invisible to. The scholarship covered a lot, but not everything. I found a room in a shared house 3 blocks from campus. 4 girls, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that smelled permanently of instant noodles. My room was small enough that I could touch both walls if I stretched my arms out. I loved it. It was mine. I got a job within the first week. Campus library, weekday evenings. Not glamorous, but steady, quiet, and it kept the lights on. I called home every Sunday. The calls were short. Mom asked if I was eating. Dad asked about grades. Arthur, when he was around, said hey and then handed the phone back. Midway through my sophomore year, I found out through Mom, mentioned casually, the way she mentioned everything she didn't want to make a big deal of, that Dad had paid for Arthur to take his driving test and bought him a used car. Arthur had decided he wanted to do delivery driving. That was the plan now. The car cost $3,000. Dad paid the whole thing. I did the math in my head while Mom was still talking. $3,000. At my library rate, that was roughly 4 months of evening shifts. I didn't say anything on the phone. I said, That's good. I hope it works out for him. And I meant it, actually. I didn't want Arthur to fail. I just wanted someone to notice that I had never been offered a $3,000 anything. I didn't ask for it. I never asked for it. But there's a difference between not asking and not being offered. One is a choice. The other is a statement about what you're worth. I kept working. I kept studying. I picked up a second small job my junior year, tutoring freshman students in intro economics, $12 an hour, 6 hours a week. I structured my schedule down to the half hour. Sleep, class, work, study, repeat. Some nights I was so tired I fell asleep with my laptop open. Some mornings I woke up and thought, I don't know how I'm going to get through this week. But I always got through the week. Every single one. And the notebook, I still had it. Different notebook by now, third one in the series. Same system. Every dollar in, every dollar out. Every goal written down in the margin. I was 20 years old, and I had more financial discipline than most adults I knew. Nobody gave me that. I built it in the dark, alone, on early Saturday mornings when everyone else was asleep. I want you to picture a Sunday dinner. I am 22 years old. I drove home for Thanksgiving, 3 hours on the highway, my own car, a used Honda I'd bought 6 months earlier with money I had saved over 2 years. First car I ever owned. I paid cash. No loan, no help, no cosigner. I had news. Real news. 2 weeks earlier, I had been promoted to department manager at the mid-sized consulting firm where I'd been working since graduation. I was the youngest person in that role in the company's 12-year history. My salary went up by nearly 40%. I had an office with a window. I had a team of 4 people who reported to me. I waited until after dinner to say anything. We were all still at the table. Dad with his coffee, Mom clearing plates, Arthur leaning back in his chair with the look he always had, somewhere between bored and vaguely irritated at the general concept of effort. I told them. I kept it simple. I got promoted, department manager. It came with a significant raise. Mom put down the plate she was holding and smiled. A real smile, wide and warm. She said, "Vera, that's wonderful." She said it twice. Dad nodded, said, "Good, that's good." His voice was what it always was. Not cold, just contained. Like everything lived behind 3 inches of glass. And then Arthur. He looked at me across the table, leaned forward slightly, and said, "Must be nice to get lucky like that." I looked at him. I didn't look away. He kept going. "I mean, you always landed on your feet. Some people just get handed things." I want you to understand what he was saying. He was sitting in our parents' house, 25 years old, sleeping in the same bedroom he'd slept in since middle school, driving a car our father had bought for him, eating food our mother had cooked, having never held a job for longer than 4 months at a stretch. And he was telling me, the person who had been working since 14, who had paid for her own education, her own car, her own apartment, her own everything, that I had gotten lucky, that things had been handed to me. Dad looked at his coffee cup. Mom said, "Arthur, please, please." Not, "That's not true." Not, "Do you have any idea what your sister has done to get here?" Just, "Please." As if it was a minor social inconvenience, rather than a window into something that had been true our entire lives. I sat at that table for another 20 minutes. I helped clear the dishes. I said goodbye politely. I drove 3 hours home in the dark. And somewhere on the highway, somewhere around mile marker 80-something, with nothing around me but flat land and headlights, something that had been quietly loosening inside me for years finally let go completely. Not with anger, not with tears, just release. The clean, quiet release of a person who has finally accepted that some things will never change and has decided that is no longer her problem to carry. I didn't cut anyone off dramatically. I didn't send a letter or make a speech or stop returning calls. I just gradually, honestly, without performance, stopped arranging my life around people who had never arranged theirs around me. Phone calls home became less frequent. Not zero, just less. And shorter. And lighter. The way a conversation feels when you've stopped hoping it will become something it never was. I had one real conversation with my mother, about 3 months after that Thanksgiving dinner. It was a Saturday morning. She had called and we had talked about nothing for a few minutes, and then she said, carefully, "I worry about you being so far away." And I said, gently, because I meant it gently, "Mom, I've been far away since I was 12. I just had to drive myself there this time." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I know. I know I should have done more." I didn't argue with that. I didn't tell her she was forgiven or that it was fine, because it hadn't always been fine. But I told her the truth, which was, I don't blame you for who you were then. I just needed you to see who I am now. She said she did. I believed her. And that was enough. Not everything, but enough. Some repairs are partial, and that is still worth something. With Dad, there were no more conversations that needed to happen. We talk when I call. He asks about work. I give him the short version. There is no longer anything unfinished between us because I have stopped waiting for something that was never coming. That's not bitterness. That's just clarity. Arthur and I don't talk much. I don't wish him harm, but I also don't miss what we never had. The last time I saw him, he looked the same. A little older, still waiting for something to come to him from the outside. I hope it does. I genuinely do. But his waiting is no longer something I carry. My life now looks like this. I have an apartment on the 4th floor of a building in a city I chose because I wanted to live there, not because I ended up there, not because someone placed me there. I have a window that faces east, and in the mornings, the light comes in at an angle that hits the kitchen table and makes the whole room look like something worth getting up for. I have a cat named June who sleeps on the end of my bed and doesn't care about any of this backstory. She just wants to be fed at 7 and petted after. I took a vacation last spring. First real vacation of my adult life. Booked, planned, and paid for entirely by me. A week in Colorado. Mountains and cold air and silence of a completely different kind than the silence I grew up in. I hiked alone for 4 hours one morning, and at the top of the trail, I sat on a rock and looked out at all that distance and thought, I made it here. Not just to this trail, to this life. This specific, particular, chosen life. Nobody handed it to me. Nobody drove me to the bus station and waited in the lobby with a proud face. Nobody sat with me at midnight while I studied. Nobody matched my savings or co-signed my lease or told me at the right moment that I was doing well. But here is what I want to say, and I mean this without bitterness, without any desire to make anyone feel guilty, because guilt is not the point. The absence of those things did not break me. It taught me something I could not have learned any other way. It taught me that I was enough. Not because I had to believe it to survive, but because I kept proving it, quietly, in notebooks and early mornings and long shifts and 3-hour drives home in the dark. There is a version of this story where I am angry, where I spend my energy cataloging what was taken from me and building a case for what I was owed. I understand that version. It would be justified. But the version I chose to live is different. I chose to take everything I built in the background, the discipline, the patience, the ability to show up when no one was watching, and I carried it forward into a life that finally has room for me in it. A life where I am not the background, where I am the whole picture. I was 14 years old, with an envelope of money and a brother who laughed. I was 22, with a promotion and a brother who called it luck. Between those two moments was every early morning, every saved dollar, every night I chose the notebook over resentment, every step I took without anyone holding my hand. That is not luck. That is a life, built from scratch by someone who decided, quietly, stubbornly, and completely alone, that she was worth building one for. If this story is yours too, even a part of it, I hope you know, the background can become the whole story. It just takes time. And it takes you deciding, one ordinary morning, that you're done being invisible. I made that decision on a bench outside our apartment complex, 11 years old, a seashell in my pocket. It just took a few more years to see where it led. Like if this story touched you. Subscribe if you want to hear more.